Well, hello there. It's good to have you back. I'm just gonna. So, I got the Syntakt. It's right here. I got this after several weeks of just kind of deep dive research, online obsession, is fair to say, and just kind of going into everything I could. I haven't read the manual cover to cover, but I've definitely skimmed through the parts of the manual where I had questions. And I've just been watching all the content that I can that's come out about it. Obviously, there's plenty out there. In terms of I would say the like fountains of knowledge that I've been drinking from about not just the Syntakt, but the Elektron kind of ecosystem in general, how the Syntakt fits into that, how it plays with the other boxes, all that. I think I've gotten the most out of EZBOT and Surco. Both of them are deeply familiar with the Elektron workflow and all the different boxes and options. They use them all to make music. And so if you really want to kind of learn from the experts, I would recommend checking out their channels and their content that they've made on the Syntakt. Both of them have done a great job. So what I wanted to offer here is basically just a first impressions kind of thing. I've only had this for less than 3 days. I think I've had maybe a total of 5 hours or so of like dedicated time to play with it. So I'm still pretty new to the whole thing. And I've been, just yesterday, I spent a lot of time specifically deep diving into one of the engines, which is the analog dual VCO engine. And I posted a video yesterday about just a snippet of that. I actually played on it for probably about an hour and a half straight and posted that 15 minutes or whatever of it. And the idea in doing that is that I really wanted to see kind of how the synthesis engines, or the machines as they call them, stack up against standalone synths. And that whole kind of train of thought is basically the basis of this video. So really what I want to talk about is not about everything that the Syntakt can do, because there's tons of other stuff about that, and I haven't personally explored everything it can do yet. It's more about the value proposition, or the value for money of what you're getting from this box. And there's it's kind of curious to me that there's a lot of chatter online about the Syntakt being underwhelming or being disappointing in certain ways. And I can say I can't relate. I find that it's definitely got limitations, sure, but every device has limitations. And if you want a device with like zero limitations, you should work with a computer in a DAW, digital audio workstation. Software is going to be the best, no limitations in a box you're ever going to find. The whole point of working with hardware is that there are some limitations. And it's in my opinion, that's kind of the whole point. Is like I want a better interface that's more fun to play with, and frankly, I don't want to have to sit in this office chair all the time. I take my synths over to the couch. I sit on the floor, sit on a bed. Like I like the portability aspect of them, and so that's kind of the angle I'm coming at from this. I don't play live. I don't do gigs or anything like that. I would like to someday, and when I do buy things, that's kind of like part of my purchasing decision, is like, would this work in the future to play live? But at the moment, I just play for the camera, and so that doesn't particularly matter. So I'm going to start off with that idea of talking about the portability of the Syntakt. So the whole kind of Digitakt, Digitone, Syntakt, analog heat form factor, this particular size of box, it's definitely very, well, first of all, it's like very robust, like all the Elektron stuff is, and so it's great for gigging in that sense. And it's portable because of its size. I mean, it's got a bit of heft to it, but it's obviously pretty small. But the thing is, and I've heard a lot of actually other YouTubers and stuff mention this, that like, oh, you could just take it with you with the ripcord to the park, or the or the cafe or whatever. And sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but no, you cannot actually. So I have the 12-volt ripcord right here. I got this specifically for the Digitone, because I also have the Digitone, and it does work for the Digitone. I believe it works for the Digitakt also. But if you look at the specs on this, the max output power of this is 12 volts, 0.75 amps, which is 9 watts total. So the most power this thing can put out is 9 watts. Now the Digitone actually requires 12 watts, 12 volts at 1 amp. And that is actually, so even with the Digitone, which is purely digital, the ripcord is underpowering it just a bit. Now, for context, most 12 volt things do actually take a range, so it doesn't have to be precisely 12 volts. But I can say from experience, the Digitone works, but there are moments where if you kind of bump it wrong or whatever, it will just reboot, and there's potential to lose your work doing that way. Elektron's very good at kind of auto-saving, so like I haven't actually lost a significant project I've been working on, but I'm very good at just saving all the time. But about the Syntakt, this 9 watts is nowhere near enough to power the Syntakt. The Syntakt has a big analog side to it, right? All the analog circuitry. It requires 24 watts to run. That's 12 volts at 2 amps. And so this provides less than half of the amount of power that you would need to run the Syntakt. So I'm sorry, you cannot run it from a ripcord, and as far as I know, you cannot run it from any USB battery that's out there today. You can't run it from a USB port, period, basically. Now, my prediction is that in hopefully the near future, like in the next couple of years, there will be a USB-C based version of the ripcord. And USB-C, that protocol can do up to 90 watts, so easily it can cover the Syntakt plus other stuff, right? So you could run a whole table of gear off a USB-C based ripcord in the future, assuming that product is developed, but it's not available today. So I just kind of want to start off with that. I also, like I think many people, had the dream of taking the Syntakt to the park or the cafe or whatever, and I'm afraid it's just not that easy. So I will say that the power cord that comes with it, they've actually made this little power brick significantly smaller than like the Digitone or the older boxes. So the power cord that comes with it is actually fairly portable, but you are still then tethered to an outlet. So that's not so bad. Now, probably if you really want this to be portable, probably what you're going to do is use a box like this. All right, this is a big lithium-ion battery with a full 120 volt inverter in it. And so of course I can just plug the power cord directly into that and run it. And this is fine, and it's pretty overkill for just one synth, but if you're trying to run a whole setup, in like a outdoor park jam or something, like, that you're probably going to need something like this. But I think this is like 150 bucks, they're pretty expensive. And it's just fairly ungainly because you'd have this, you'd have a surge protector plugged into it, you'd have all your synths plugged into it, maybe you're using some off USB, like it's just kind of a big, cable mess. So I would say that's not really that portable either. It's like for a outdoor gig or something, it makes sense, but you're not going to just like pop down to the cafe with this. So what I've been doing just around the house here is using this, and I've been intending to make a whole video on just the usefulness of this. What this is it's a mini UPS, a DC uninterruptible power supply, which basically means it's a big battery in a box that's designed to run digital computers, such as routers and switches and like networking equipment like that. So this is the thing that you install so that when the power goes out, your internet doesn't immediately go out. Right? That's the purpose of this box. So this is in no way meant to be portable or for music devices or gigging or anything like that. This is meant for you to plug it in, sit it on a shelf, and let it sit there forever. But what's great about it is it has all of these direct DC outputs. So it's got two 5-volt USB. It's got a single 9-volt, which is what all the Korg stuff takes. And then it's got 4 different 12-volt outputs, 4 of them. And it uses, it just comes with a bunch of these short little DC barrel connectors. And this thing will perfectly power the Syntakt. Let me just plug it in right here. It's got its own little battery indicator on there. And there we go, Syntakt is booting up. So this, if you read the specs on this thing, those 4 12-volt outputs, they share a max of 4 amps. So the Syntakt is taking fully half of what this can produce because the Syntakt requires 2 amps, this can do 4 amps. So I could power a second thing off this. So for example, if I wanted to run both the Syntakt and the Digitone off this one battery, I could do that and it would be fine. But there's not a ton of headroom there. So I'm finding this thing to be pretty darn useful. I think it's about $60. So in terms of value, it's not bad. And also compared to the cost of buying like a whole bunch of ripcords and a bunch of different smaller batteries, you can easily get up to the $60 range. So I'm finding good value in this little guy. But my big warning about this particular model I'm using is that the power brick that it comes with, the AC adapter, The BMS, which is the battery management system, which is basically the computer that controls the charging curves of any lithium-ion battery. So, for example, your phone or laptop have a BMS built into it, and the purpose of that device is so that the battery doesn't catch on fire. With any lithium-ion battery, if you overcharge it or you use a charging curve that's incorrect, it's possible for there to be a thermal runaway event, and the whole thing catches on fire. And so it's very dangerous. So the BMS, using a proper BMS for any lithium-ion battery, is extremely important. It's mandatory. The problem is that this particular unit has the BMS in the AC adapter instead of in the battery itself. And that, in my opinion, is a huge safety flaw. It's just a design flaw, because this is a very standard barrel connector. I could use any other like power brick that looks just like this and plug it in there, and that thing would probably start charging, but there would not be a protection circuit to prevent it from overcharging and potentially exploding. So this particular design, I would say I don't recommend this particular model because of that design flaw, but I've looked recently and there are other competing products from other manufacturers. If you want to look into this whole realm of thing, you're going to look for a DC space UPS. Just search that in Google or Amazon or wherever, and you'll see all those options. And it's really convenient, but there's risks associated with it, and you should know those risks going into it. Also, I'm pretty sure this battery is way too big to take on an airplane. So if you want something for like a flight case, this probably is not the solution. But for my purposes, all I'm doing right now is I just want to be able to take the Syntakt from my little table here over to the couch, over to the bed, over to the floor, or the backyard, or whatever, and just play on it for 30 minutes, an hour, and this is working great for that. More about the power. So last night I played on this thing with that setup, the battery and the Syntakt alone. I played on that setup for kind of as long as I could until the battery ran out. And so when it's fully charged, a lithium-ion battery like this, if it outputs 12 volts, what it actually is a 11.1 volt nominal, which means that it's, I'm getting way too technical on this, but whatever. This is basically three lithium-ion battery cells in series. You add them together and you get 11.1 volts. So that would be like, the nominal means like the normal charge. And then when you fully charge that, it gets up to 12.6 volts. So if this thing's fully charged and I plug in the Syntakt has up to 12.6 volts that it can pull from, which is good because the Syntakt needs 12. And when I played last night until I finally got to the point where it died and it could no longer power the Syntakt, well, what this does, and in my experience what the Digitone does too, well, I think all the Elektron boxes do, is it just gets into this reboot loop. If it's not getting enough power, it'll just reboot itself over and over and over, so it's unusable. And definitely, anytime you have a flash memory device like this and it's rebooting multiple times quickly, there's potential to corrupt or wipe that flash memory. So it's not a good situation to be in. If that starts happening, you want to just turn it off right away. And so after the Syntakt could no longer run, I measured the output of this, and I got 11.75, I think, volts, somewhere in that range. So I can say, the Syntakt will run from 12.6 volts down to about 11.5 volts before it now needs more power. So in terms of the usable range of this battery, it's not that much. I haven't done a full runtime test yet, but I'm guessing if I was just running the Syntakt, I would get something like an hour, hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, about that. It's not going to run it all night. So that's another consideration. This type of battery may not be a good fit if you just really need to run it for a long time. Okay, so that's a lot about powering the Syntakt, but for my purposes of like the dream of it being portability, the way that you power it's pretty important. So yeah, that was kind of the first bit of shock for me, I guess, is that I couldn't just simply power it with a ripcord. That said, let's talk about what the device does when it is powered on. So as I'm sure you know if you're watching this, it has 35 different machines in it. Machines is their term for sound engines. Most of those are digital, and then some of them are analog. And you have the 12 different tracks, and they can each run a variety of machines per track. There's some that are limited, for example, like the analog cymbal machine. It can only run its own little things. You can't swap it out with other analog tracks. So there's a few little limitations like that, but it's pretty flexible. There's a lot you can do with that. And so I don't think there's any real room to criticize the amount of sound engines that are in there. I mean, I think we're all hoping that they will add more in the future. That'll be great, but like There's nothing wrong with the 35 that are in there. And especially because of those 35, there's some that are real highlights of like, you can just go deep, deep, deep with these machines. So the one I explored yesterday was the dual VCO machine, which can be run on up to 3 of the analog tracks simultaneously. So in the video I posted yesterday, I only used it on a single track. But if you wanted to, a dual VCO can be detuned to play an interval or a 2-note chord, and you can do 3 of those. So you could build 6-note chords, basically. Like I could program this so I pressed a single key on a keyboard or a drum pad or whatever, and it would play a 6-note analog chord. And so in terms of creating like, warm analog tones and textures, like for ambient kind of stuff, it's, more than powerful enough. There's just a ton of sonic ground you can cover with that. And then on the digital tracks, there's also several different approaches, several different types of synthesis. So I think that that's really one of the things that adds a ton of value to the Syntakt, is that it offers so many different methods of synthesis within the box. So the thing that really kind of drew me was the analog side of it, because I don't have any other Elektron stuff that's analog. And frankly, the other analog stuff I have, like my primary analog stuff is the Minilog XD and the Dreadbox Typhon. And both of those, I use an Elektron sequencer to sequence them. I don't really like the internal sequencers on either of those. And so having, even if it's not as full-fledged as like the Minilog XD or the Typhon, having some amount of analog tone producing capability all within the Elektron box, to me was a huge draw. The other thing I really, really love to do is pass things through analog effects. I do that a pretty budget-friendly way here with the Monotron delay, this cheap little unit. But this thing, it sounds awesome. It's a one-trick pony for sure, but like, its trick is good, so I still use it. And so the analog effects block on the Syntakt for me adds a ton of value also, because it's even better than something like the Monotron delay. And it allows me to travel, with just the one box instead of having a bunch of random cables and stuff I have to connect. For me, that's adding a lot of value, definitely. So yeah, of the different sound creation engines, the machines, you've got kind of like your classic dual oscillator analog monosynth that can just sound huge and really, really, very powerful. You have 2 different waveforms. Each analog oscillator can be running a different waveform, and you can mix or balance between the 2. You can also do frequency modulation using those analog waveforms, and you get ring mod also. Like, all that stuff is very, very powerful. You have a lot of options. I would say in terms of, even compared to like the Minilog, like it can make some sounds that the Minilog can't, which is surprising, right? Now that said, the Minilog can also make sounds that the Syntakt can't, so they're just kind of different approaches. But yeah, in terms of it being like a really solid analog monosynth, I'd say yeah, it has you covered. You don't necessarily need an external monosynth. That said, I still really enjoy having an external monosynth, and there's no reason to get rid of it if you already have one that you like. But if you're looking for a box that contains that as one of its functions while also doing a bunch of other stuff, the Syntakt brings a lot to the table there. And then in the digital engines, there's also a lot of really great melodic tone capabilities there. The Bits engine and the Tone engine are both really, really powerful, and the Toy engine too. The Tone engine is a 2-op FM, which is something that I really enjoy playing with. It's just a more simple way of doing frequency modulation. And like, I do that on both the Minilog XD and the NTS-1. There's some nice 2-op FM digital engines you can run on that. And then on the Digitone is 4-op, so it's more complex, but sometimes I will simplify it to make it a 2-op, just if that's what I want to do. So I find 2-op FM to be really fun, really useful, and to me that's a great engine to play with. And then the chord engine actually is really powerful too, because it's a wavetable, and you can scan through the wavetable. And you can use it to play chords, of course, but you can also use it just as a single voice if you want. And so the digital engine there, I think, are really, the melodic digital engines are the ones I've explored the most so far, and they're just fantastic. The Bits engine, you can just kind of make anything you want. And one of the best things about the Bits engine is it has a dedicated noise oscillator that you can mix in and out. And so you can use it as like just as a noise source. And I think there's a lot of potential for that. I was using it yesterday just to make that kind of whooshing ocean sound. Have basically a pure noise oscillator, drench it in reverb with an LFO that kind of slowly brings it out, and it's really nice for just kind of that ambient texture. The same kind of thing, like I play with tape a lot also. I shouldn't say I play with a lot. I play with tape sometimes. I want to do it more than I do. But like the way that I use tape loops, or even just playing a blank tape just to get that kind of like hissy noise in there, I think that type of sound can be achieved pretty closely with the bits engine on the digital side. So I'm really happy with that one too. So yeah, in terms of sound synthesis capabilities, like I have a hard time thinking of a lot of other devices that can do so much in one box. So many different types of synthesis. Like that's one of the main reasons that I recommend the Minimal XD to people, because it can do, analog subtractive. It can do digital FM, like 2-op FM. It can do virtual analog. It can do some kind of wave table stuff. It can do vector synthesis. Like there's a lot that it can do in the one box. And so in terms of like the range of different synthesis options you have, I would say the Syntakt rivals the Minimal XD pretty well. Now in terms of the effects side of it, I don't want to pass judgment on that yet, because the whole analog effects block and the whole concept of like using the effects block on the Syntakt and the sequencer there to design your own effects, that's something I haven't really dove into yet, and I'm really excited about it. That's one of the big value adds for me. And so I don't want to offer judgment there until I've had more time to play with that. But it was definitely a big selling point for me, because I look at something like the Elektron Analog Heat, for example, and I'm like, that looks and sounds like a beautiful box, but man, that's a lot of money for just the one effects processor. I really can't justify the Analog Heat in my setup. But the fact that the Syntakt brings, a simplified version of that to the table, like adds a lot of value to me. So I think that's a big part of it. I think that the main thing I've read about or heard about where people are disappointed is that it's not it's not an analog polyphonic synth. And it's like, I guess I get that. I mean, I'm a keys piano player also. I do enjoy playing in that style, that polyphonic input style. But, that's what the Digitone's for. It's a beautiful 8-voice polysynth. And then also, in terms of like a big, lush analog polysynth, there's so many other companies that make great options for that. That's kind of just not Elektron's thing. Like they have the Digitone, they have the A4. There's just not really, big polysynths aren't really their forte. And so to me, I'm not really disappointed in that at all. Like, would it be cool if it could do it? Sure. But I don't know if I personally would use it that much. I'd still probably end up using the Digitone or some other, more dedicated polysynth, because that's just, you want to have kind of specialist gear. You want to have like the right tool for the job. And so in my opinion, it's just not a big deal that it's not an analog polysynth. It's not trying to be, it's not what it's intended to be. Now, if you do, if I think you're looking at it from the frame of like, well, I have $1,000 to spend. I want to get the most bang for the buck I can get. Yeah, the Syntakt may not be that. There's stuff like the Deluge or the MC707, things that can just do a lot more. They have a lot more polyphony. They have a lot more ability to create an entire song in one box. I don't think the Syntakt is really designed to be like create an entire song in one box. You certainly can use it that way, and there's very few limitations preventing you from doing that. But really, all the Elektron gear is designed to be used in conjunction with and in context with other gear, right? That's why it has audio inputs. That's why it does MIDI, implementations so thoroughly and so well. Like you can use it to send program changes to other gear, to select the right preset at the right time. Like, I mean, there's so many things you can do when talking with other gear from an Elektron box. So I just think that's the context it's designed around. It's not really designed to be a standalone unit. But that said, if I'm traveling and I can't take very much with me and I want the Syntakt to be a standalone unit while I'm traveling, it's going to have no problem with that, outside of the complications of powering it that I've already mentioned. But as long as I have, easy power in a hotel room or something, like, yeah, it's all I'm going to need to like have fun and mess around while I'm traveling. So I think that it definitely offers a lot in that regard. Okay, so let's talk for a minute about the role that the Syntakt plays in context with the other Elektron boxes that you might be interested in or you might already own. So it's most closely related to the rhythm and to the model cycles. Now, I've never used the rhythm, so I can't really speak to it. I've also never used the model cycles, but I do have the model samples, so I get it, you know. And I also have the digitone, so I get the whole, you know, Elektron FM soundscape pretty well, I think. So I would say that if you already own either the rhythm or the model cycles or both, yeah, I can understand why you might be a bit disappointed because the Syntakt doesn't offer a whole lot on top of what those boxes can already do. And so I could see that, but the other things that really pulls a bit from analog heat, obviously. I think in a lot of practical purposes for many people, just based on budget constraints, the Syntakt does kind of make the analog heat obsolete because, like, why would I spend $600 to $800 on a box that does one thing when I can spend, you know, $1,000 on a box that does that one thing plus a whole bunch of other stuff, right? It's just a better value. Also, I would say it steals from the Digitakt in terms of just the UI. It's the exact same button layout and all that, but obviously the things you can do with it are vastly different from the Digitakt. It pulls from the Digitone only in that it has some FM capabilities, but I don't think there's a whole ton of overlap with the Digitone. The Digitone just, it does its own thing. It's a very specialized FM synth, whereas the Syntakt, you know, has a little bit of FM, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's like the best FM synth out there. It's not. So, you know, I think that the other thing I think that really excited me is it pulls a little bit conceptually from the Octatrack, which, you know, of course, it has no sampling capability, so it's not touching that side of it at all. But in terms of the Octatrack being a performance mixer, well, all of the digiboxes now can do a bit of simple mixing, right? You can have stereo inputs or dual mono inputs, and so you can mix between two different mono sources quite effectively. So, and, you know, it's a very basic mixer, but it can do that. What's more interesting to me about the Octatrack is the ability to create your own effects, like design your own performance effects using scenes and parts. And it's something, I don't own an Octatrack. I've only kind of like watched videos on it. And I was definitely on the path, and I think I'm still on the path of saying, like, I definitely want an Octatrack someday. It's on my, you know, it's on my wish list for the future because it's its own thing. It does its own thing kind of so particularly well. And I would, you know, EZBOT's videos have been kind of showing the Syntakt and the Octatrack together, showing that workflow together, and like that's definitely really appealing to me. But I would say, like, it, for me at least, it put off my desire for the Octatrack. I'd say it probably pushed it back several years. Like, I still want to get one eventually, but the Syntakt has enough potential in that concept of designing your own effects, applying those effects to both its internal sounds as well as external audio you're routing through it, and making that into a performance. It seems like the Syntakt can do a lot in that regard, and so that adds a ton of value. So, so yeah, I can see, like, if you already have any or multiple of those Elektron boxes I just mentioned, and you see the Syntakt come out and you're like, well, this has so much overlap with what I already have, it's not really that interesting to me. I think I understand, and I think that's a positive thing. Like, it's totally fine to, you know, quickly realize that one piece of gear isn't for you because it's too much overlap or it doesn't add enough to, you know, your arsenal. Like, that's great. You just saved $1,000, right? So for me, I don't own any of those devices, right? I own, in terms of Elektron, I own the Digitone and I own the model samples, and that's it. And I can say that I started with the model samples, and I played on that for about a year and a half. And after that year and a half, I was, you know, so thoroughly like into the Elektron workflow and the Elektron way, then I could easily justify buying more Elektron boxes because I'm like, yeah, this is the thing for me. And so then I got the Digitone, and I've been loving the Digitone. I'm still even scratching the surface on that. There's a lot deeper I want to go with that one. And now the Syntakt is kind of the same thing, where it's like, it's an easy decision because I know I love the workflow, I know I love the sequencer, despite its various limitations and quirkiness. Like, that's part of the fun for me. And so the Syntakt was an easy addition on top of the other Elektron stuff I already own. And I will say I'm considering that the Syntakt may make my model samples obsolete. Now, that's not to say that they do the same thing, because they don't at all, right? A sample player, a sample mangler, and a synth are just totally separate things. But the way that I personally use the model samples, I mostly use it as a synth. I've realized that like if I want it to just be a drum machine, then yeah, I'll play drum samples, and that's great. And but in terms of like doing synthesis, I do the wave cycle and wave table synthesis that I've made videos about already, and it's like a really kind of deep divey technical way of making sounds, and it's really fun. I really enjoy it. But now that I can make basically everything I could do on the model samples, for the most part, I could do with just the one digital chord machine on the Syntakt, because that's also wavetable. Now, I don't get to choose my own wavetables. I'm hoping that's an update in the future where we get to load our own wavetables in there for specifically that chord machine, or maybe other machines too. But that said, like, I mean, it's a very nice wavetable they put in there, so that's okay. So in terms of the way I use the model samples, being both, a sample-based drum machine and a 6-track monosynth, like wavetable monosynth, both of those functions are pretty well covered by the Syntakt. So I'm not going to get rid of my model samples right away, but I could see myself just moving on from it in general. The one thing I probably will keep the model samples for is just general portability. It's so easy to throw it in a backpack, take it to the park, take it to the cafe, run it off a battery. It's a much cheaper device, so I'm not worried about losing it as much. So I think the model samples may kind of be less of a studio piece for me and more of just a portable travel piece. We'll see how that goes. But yeah, so I can see that happening. I also was definitely on the track of like, I'm going to get the Digitakt eventually, because it's its own particular thing. It's got this really cool hyper-focused workflow for sample-based drums. Like the Digitakt really is a drum machine. I mean, that's just kind of what it's best used for. And I would say my desire for the Digitakt is also pushed back, by a couple of years, maybe forever, because as much as it is fun to play drum samples, I think it's way more fun to do drum synthesis. And so I think I'm just most of the time going to prefer the Syntakt for that. One other way that I've been using the model samples is that I've been loading it up with samples from fancier and more expensive drum machines. So for example, stuff from Vermonia I think is just amazing. It's all stuff that's like well out of my price range at the moment, but like the DRM1 is just such a cool drum machine. And so I have or stuff like the Pulsar 23, I mean, just like there's these really kind of high-end $2,000+ drum machines that like I drool over, but I can't justify spending that kind of money on a drum machine. So instead, I find out the people that make sample packs from those, and I get them. Some are free, some are paid, and I load them onto something like the model samples, and I play them back, and I have those sounds to mess with. And I can say that like while I do enjoy those sounds, it's I think I'm going to have more fun just creating my own sounds on the Syntakt, and maybe those sounds are inspired by something like the Vermonia DRM1, but it's going to be its own thing, its own flavor. So I think that for me, drum synthesis and just synthesis in general just holds a lot of appeal, more so than sample-based workflows. The whole kind of MPC aspect of like sample chopping and all that, it's not something that has appealed to me all that much. And I did also, if you can make it out right there, I did also recently get the black box, which also has all those capabilities. So I think I'm pretty well covered if I do decide to go further down that path in the future. So for me, the lack of sampling capability in the Syntakt, it's just not that big of a deal, because it's just I have other devices that do it, and because it's just not something I'm that keenly interested in, I guess. If I wanted an MPC, I'd get an MPC, but it's just a different thing. So so yeah, the one thing though I will say I am legitimately disappointed by in the Syntakt, and I knew this before I bought it, but is that of those 12 tracks, any one of them or all of them can be a Midi track, which is great because the Midi sequencer is great. 4-note polyphony on each of those Midi tracks. I think it's enough. Yeah, I would prefer 8-note, but I mean, for vast majority of what I do, I'm sequencing monosynths, so 4 notes is 3 notes more than enough. And then, so I think that's fine. And given that there's 12 tracks, there's plenty of room to have some of them be MIDI tracks. Now that said, so I guess I should say the lack of dedicated MIDI tracks like the Digitac and the Digitone have doesn't bother me that much. If I really need a dedicated MIDI track, I have the Digitone for that. But the one feature of the model samples that I love, and I really wish the Syntakt had it, I should say the model samples and the model cycles both have this feature, and the Syntakt does not have this feature, which is that any of the tracks can be both simultaneously an audio track and a MIDI track, which means that you can use a single track to both play its own internal sound, whether that's a sample or an FM synth with the cycles, while also sending out MIDI notes to some other external piece of gear. And I use that function heavily. In fact, one of my little kind of, I would say like a little custom drum machine I basically built out of this gear is I have the model samples, which has 6 tracks. Each of those is playing its own internal sample. It's also simultaneously sending out MIDI information to the Volca drum. The Volca drum also has 6 tracks, and it does FM-based drum synthesis. And so between that, I can layer one sample and up to 2 layers of FM drum synth, all on the same hit, all on the same note or trigger. And so it's like, it's really, you can do some really interesting drum synthesis when you're layering samples and some other form of synthesis. And like that's the whole concept behind the analog rhythm, I think, is that you're layering samples and synthesis. And so to me, I don't really mind using multiple pieces of gear to do that. I think it's kind of fun. But the fact that the Syntakt cannot simultaneously play an internal sound while also sending MIDI out on that same track is, it's disappointing for me for sure. Now what you can do is you can take a single track, write your MIDI sequence, and then just copy it into an adjacent track and have one of the tracks play an internal sound, another one send out as a MIDI track to an external piece of gear. So, I mean, that's a fairly simple workaround. It's not that bad. But it's a little more fiddly. It's not as immediate. And I do hope that a future firmware update allows any of the tracks on the Syntakt to be both simultaneously an audio and a MIDI track. I think that's a super powerful feature of the model cycles and model samples, and I use it all the time, and I would like to use it on the Syntakt. So that's in my opinion, a kind of a legitimate con, but something that I think can be addressed in future firmware. We'll see. Let's talk about velocity sensitivity really quick. The Syntakt and all the rest of the Digitac Digitone boxes do not have velocity sensitivity whatsoever. They do respond to it from an external controller, and so like what I've been using is, a little drum pad controller like this in order to control those boxes, and that's pleasant. But there's nothing built in. Now that said, given how the velocity sensitive pads on the model samples and model cycles turned out, yeah, I don't know if that's going to ever be Elektron's forte. It just didn't really, it's not good. It's not good on the model boxes at all, to the point where it's like, if they just didn't have it, I would probably be okay with that, because the implementation is so disappointing that it's like, it's frustrating to have something and have it not work well. It's better to just not have it, kind of. So I'm not particularly disappointed that there's no velocity sensitivity, and their kind of new thing with the modifiers of how you can have 4 different levels of velocity that you use to input things. I think it's an interesting workaround, and it's usable in the kind of portable sense where I just want to have everything in one box and not deal with a bunch of other stuff. But if I'm at home and I'm playing in the larger studio context, I'm just going to use a velocity sensitive pad controller. I mean, that's just going to be a more natural and easy way of doing it. So to me, that's not a huge deal. That said, other $1,000 boxes do have velocity sensitivity, and some of them are quite good at it. So that's certainly a consideration, especially if you're looking for like a finger drumming type of experience. You could build that based on the Syntakt, but it's not going to come out of the box like that, and it's probably just not really the right choice if that's the kind of style or music that you want to make. Retrig's a big one for me. Retrig is one of my favorite features on the model samples. I use it constantly, and it is not available on the Digitone. Now in the Digitone, you can kind of make your own custom retrig based on the arpeggiator, but it's way more time intensive and more fiddly, and it's just, you can't just like punch it in. The modifiers option for retrig on the Syntakt, I think, is very interesting. I haven't dove into it too much yet, but I definitely intend to use that quite a bit. So that to me was a big selling point that it has retrig. Another one is sidechain compression. So the Syntakt does not technically have sidechain compression in the sense that you can't. There's no compressor. You cannot sidechain a compressor. However, what it does have is on the analog effects track, it has a ducking envelope. So you can do sidechain ducking, where it's bringing down the amp volume or something to make that pumping sidechain effect. And that is something that I don't have in any other piece of hardware. Technically, the Novation circuit can do it to itself. I don't think it can do it to external gear. Maybe the circuit tracks can, but the original one can't. But I just don't really use the circuit that much. And so yeah, that was something I have not been able to do in hardware previously. So the fact that I can do sidechain ducking both on the internal sounds and on external stuff that I route through it, to me, that's a big value add as well. So that was definitely one of the features that I was excited about. And then let's talk for a minute just about the Elektron sequencer in general. I think there's kind of a lot of pushback of like there's the people that are way into Elektron, and I have to say I'm one of them, that were like we can just kind of see the Elektron sequencer as like this just bountiful playground of sequencing capabilities. Like one of my favorite things to do with any Elektron box is to make generative patterns or generative sequences, meaning that the sequence is changing itself over time in ways that you can't necessarily predict. So I would say a big part of the way that I like to make music is where like the whole reason I'm into hardware in general is like when I sit down to make music, I often have zero idea of what I want out of it. Sometimes I have a basic concept or a little like tune in my head or something, but most of the time I'm sitting down and I'm just like, let's just start somewhere and see where we wind up. And whether that's like ambient or more kind of dance or more like glitchy IDM kind of stuff, it doesn't matter. I kind of start, the same way. So often I'm just putting down random trigs, random notes, whatever, and then evolving that over time to become something that I like. And so the Syntakt offers a lot of capabilities for that. One, it has the synth randomizer function where every single page of parameters you can randomize individually, but it doesn't randomize the pitch, which is great. So you can write your melodic sequence first and then go through and randomize the tone or the timbre or the texture of it without changing the actual notes that are playing, which is a fantastic idea. And so that is really, really cool. Like the Volca drum, for example, also does have this really nice randomizer feature, but it does randomize the pitch, which means that you're just going to get a random note every time when you use that feature. So you have to use the feature first and then write your melodic sequence afterwards, if that makes sense. So, I'm really excited about the randomizer, and I think it's just a great tool. There's a lot of sequencers out there now that have probability, and probability by itself is great, but it's one tool. You need, in my opinion, you need more than that. Having just probability makes the music end up sounding just a bit too random. And so what I love about the Elektron boxes is the interplay between probability and conditional triggers, because you can basically, instead of making random music, you can make chaotic music, where it's like your randomness within certain parameters, you kind of contained it within a box. And since you can also, have that all be locked into a scale, you can set it up where if you want it to play random notes within a scale where every note's going to sound good, you can do that very easily. Or you can also have it, instead of being random notes, it can play certain notes on different patterns that interact with each other. So one of my favorite things to do with any Elektron box is to create these kind of logic puzzles where, say, okay, if track 1 is doing this, then track 3 is silenced, like it can't do anything. But then as soon as I mute track 1, track 3 springs to life and does all this other stuff. And it's like stuff like that, where it's kind of a lot of these if-then statements. I mean, that's what conditional triggers means. A conditional in logic is an if-then statement. If this happens, then that happens. Or if this happens, then this does not happen. So to me, that's super fun with any Elektron box, the Syntakt included. And so it's kind of like once I got into the model samples and really kind of thoroughly learned that Elektron sequencer and the possibilities that comes out of it, every other sequencer has paled in comparison for me. It's just I think that if you have the approach like I do of like you sit down, you don't really know where you want to go, you just want to explore sounds and sequences and patterns, Elektron is great for that. If instead you're the opposite, where like you sit down and you're like, I know exactly the song I want in my head, I want to achieve this particular tone, this particular sound, this particular rhythm, you can do it with Elektron, but it may not be the quickest or most natural workflow for that. For that type of approach, frankly, I would suggest the Novation sequencer that's in the Circuit or the SL Mark III or Launchpad series. I mean, the Novation sequencer is just really quick for being like, I know what I want here. This chord, punch it in here. This one, punch it in. You know, it's very much more of a you know, you're sitting down and writing your own sheet music, whereas like the Elektron is like you're sitting down and just like pulling random stuff from a grab bag and seeing what sounds good or what excites you or what intrigues you, you know. So I really, for me, it's beautiful. It's super fun, but I understand it's not for everybody. So yeah, I think I'm wrapping up here. I guess my summary of like the value proposition of the Syntakt, what you're getting in the one box for $1,000 or, you know, hopefully cheaper on the used market in the future, is a lot. You're getting a lot of different types of synthesis, so both digital and analog, you know, FM, wavetable, virtual analog if you want, analog subtractive, analog FM, physical modeling. I mean, it's a wide array. I can think of a few types of synthesis that aren't present here, like vector synthesis I think is not present here, but it could be added in the future, we'll see. You know, and it's a ton of synthesis capabilities. Like, yes, it's designed around being a drum synth, so a lot of that synthesis is going to be more in the percussive realm, but I mean, it's just no slouch on the melodic side whatsoever. Well, I'll put it this way. So in terms of me wanting to create a lot of the melodic, like all the monophonic melodic stuff I'd want to do, like bass lines and even also like chord progressions, I feel like the Syntakt pretty much covers everything I would want to do. Now, since I also have other gear that does that, I may still use other gear sometimes, but I don't need the other gear. It's just kind of fluff and flavor and you know, different alternate textures on top of it. If I want to sit down and play a big keyboard in a piano type style, the Syntakt is not what I'm going to go to for that. I'm going to use the Digitone or maybe the Minimal XD, and it's you know, it's just not a polysynth. But I would say that you're a really solid just entire setup if you just want a small number of boxes that covers pretty much every thing you can think of. It would be the Syntakt and the polysynth of your choice. Pick whichever one inspires you, you know, and a keyboard. And then maybe a drum pad MIDI controller too if you want to do like finger drumming stuff. Those 3 or 4 devices, I mean, that's just kind of all you need. Like, that's a lot, you know, in terms of the world of synthesis. Yeah, so I mean, I can say that the vast majority of the music I'm going to be making in the next couple months or year or whatever is going to be synthesis, you know, all my percussive synthesis based on the Syntakt, as well as a few melodic bits. And then all of my melodic synthesis is going to be mostly from the Digitone, you know, the Minilog, maybe the Typhon, like my kind of other dedicated synths for that. And yeah, I can see my whole setup here is kind of sprawling right now. I mean, you can see I've got stuff there on this side and stuff over here. And I can really imagine my whole setup is going to be condensing a lot because the Syntakt just does so much in one box. It's hard to say goodbye to these little devices that I've come to love so much, you know, but stuff like, for example, the monotron delay, it's like, I'm never going to sell this thing because it's just so cool for what it does, but like, I really don't need it anymore. It's pretty obsolete. You know, so in terms of like all the gear that I have, if I added up all the capabilities that the Syntakt has in one box, in terms of all the other external gear I have, I would easily be over $1,000. Like, you know, if I tried to build kind of a whole table full of synth and effects and such that could replicate everything the Syntakt can do in more like specialist devices, yeah, I think you'd easily be in the $1,500 range. You know. And I think that that's kind of that's part of what kind of baffles me about everybody feeling so disappointed or saying that it's like $1,000 is expensive for this, because I mean, sure, $1,000 is expensive for any dedicated synth. I mean, if it's out of your budget, it's out of your budget. But in terms of like, I think what the Syntakt is really competing with is like is Elektron's far more expensive boxes that are all in the kind of $1,500 range, like the Analog Rhythm, and even stuff like the Vermonia that's up in the $2,000 range. Like I feel like it's competing at that level. The fact that it's in the same size box as the Digitakt and Digitone makes everyone naturally compare it to those. And it's like, well, yeah, it is more expensive than those, but it can do way more than the Digitakt or Digitone. In terms of the breadth of what it can do, I would say the Digitakt and Digitone are both more focused. The Digitakt is going to be dedicated, like probably a better dedicated drum machine. If that's all you want it to do is be a drum machine, nothing else, and you really love working with samples, probably the Digitakt is going to be a better choice for that. And if you want just a big poly FM synth, to play with a two-handed piano style with aftertouch and all the kind of fanciness you can get from that, the Digitone is going to be better for that. I mean, that's just its thing. The Syntakt is more of covers a lot of bases. And, there's always kind of the risk with that, any device that does a ton of stuff in one box, there's always the risk that it's like, well, it's a jack of all trades, master of none. And I want to withhold judgment on that concept regarding the Syntakt right now, because I think that really applies to almost every big groove box you can think of. Even something like the other ones I mentioned, the Deluge and the MC707 and stuff like that. I mean, it's just they can do so much. The OP1 is a good example, right? The OP1 can do a crazy amount of stuff. But if you look at each individual thing it does, like, is it the best synth out there? No, definitely not. Like the best, the thing the OP1 is the best at is being portable, super duper portable, right? But in terms of all the other things it does, you can think of better examples. There's better sequencers, there's better synths, there's better effects. Like, it's just the whole package for some people, like to be able to throw that in your backpack or whatever, is super useful. And I think that's really what the Syntakt is trying to do also, is just offer a ton of value in one package, if that's the kind of thing you need. If you're producing purely in a studio, you never travel anywhere, and all your boxes are just always permanently set up and plugged in and pre-routed and all that, and like you just turn everything on and make your music that way, then yeah, maybe the Syntakt is not the best choice for that. You might be better off breaking up the Syntakt's functionality into 2 or 3 separate boxes that are more specialist in each of those categories, right? Like, I'm really excited about the analog effects blocks processing, but that doesn't mean that it's the best, effects box out there. Okay, I hope that was helpful for somebody. Sorry I'm so long-winded in these things. I really try to keep it brief, but I like to hear myself talk, I guess. So, all right, well, thanks for joining. See you next time.